Hi, this is Mika from the post-editing world. Now, podcasts like this take a bloody long piece of time to edit the visuals for, and I don't really have that much time at the moment, so future podcasts aren't going to have any visuals at all. Knowing that, there's still lovely audio, so please have fun listening to the Trinity Podcast. Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the Trinity Podcast, because Prawn Wizard is not here, sadly. We don't really know where he's gone, but he certainly can't do an intro for this podcast. Today, we've got quite a few topics to bring up, all around the general consensus of removal. We've sort of separated this list into spell trap removal, monster removal, and just generic removal that's played. The goal here isn't really to make a top 10 list, or any sort of like system by saying that these cards are better than other removal options. We're just trying to inform people of kind of the weird and niche pieces of removal that are played, as well as why some pieces of removal are played. A lot of the cards here are not really played in the TCG, generally because Trinity is quite different to the TCG in how you're trying to make removal. A good place to start here with monster removal is Chimera Tech Mega Fleet Dragon. In the TCG, it's used to get out of extra links and such. Guys, what do you think of Mega Fleet and Trinity? How's it different?
The Chimera Tech boys and Cyber Dragon, as is pretty clear from the recent World Championship, they're like played to great effect in the TCG because they're one of the only things that can like reasonably out Goki extra link boards. But in Trinity, no one gets extra linked. Not even our boy Prawn himself, who designed a Trinity legal under the summon limit extra link, which requires like 8 specific cards in hand. That's not practical. Basically, it just never happens. However, Cyber Dragon's still very useful because in Trinity, it's actually like reasonable for someone to just field a single extra deck monster with their 3 summons for a turn and pass if it's something like Minerva or like Meteor Black Comet Dragon. And so being able to... Cyber Dragon is useful in that it can be an instant response to that sort of threat while also being a counter push in it, because it acts as like 2-for-1 removal. You can special it, contact fuse, and then you like that removes an opponent's threat, and it generates a like 2400 usually dude for your own for Mega Fleet. And if it's against something like Cosmos or a machine deck, it can be like a wide variety of attacks if you play Fortress Dragon. But yeah, so it serves a different niche, but is still very useful.
I think a thing that separates Mega Fleet from like the rest of this list is how it's actually a threat in itself. Like a lot of the other cards here, we're talking about sort of Soul Taker or something, just 1-for-1 kill a monster. But Mega Fleet Dragon actually leaves you with something on the field afterwards, which is pretty powerful.
Yeah, like there's like a paradigmatic difference in how removal has to exist in Trinity than it has to exist in the TCG, because in the TCG, it's like, if you survive to the point where you can use your removal spell, you have to play it immediately or else you're going to die next turn, when that's not how Trinity functions. That's not how any slower Yu-Gi-Oh format functions. And understanding like how to use your removal and like removal that is more situational but more powerful, it like those things come up more in a way where like people actually legitimately play sphere mode sometimes just because it's the most bang for your buck in single card removal, even though it's like super specific and situational and would never be able to be summoned in Trinity.
Yeah, Mega Fleet also obviously has some issues with the restriction on Cyber Dragon, provided you're using Cyber Dragon, meaning you sometimes will have to just tribute summon a Cyber Dragon. It does use any Cyber Dragon cards, so you can use the smaller ones with good effects. For example, recent release, we have the level 1, I believe his name is Hertz, and he can search the real Sidra when he's sent to the graveyard, which is great, but overall the restrictions on Mega Fleet, using up your summons, being based on a monster.
Yeah, though like it that also creates a niche for like, because it can be any Cyber Dragon monster, that means that you can also do things like play a package of Cyber Dragon and then also Cyber Dragon Core, because you can like use Core to summon your other Cyber Dragon from deck and like not only remove the monster as a +1, remove it as a +2 because the Cyber Dragon was free in the first place. And I know that one of our competitors did that. Was that? I think the month that Guilty won, he played the VA with the Cyber Dragon package with the level 3 one because making Dante is good, but also with Core because you can sometimes mill it with Dante and get a lot of value out of that.
I think the big problem with Mega Fleet is how specific it is. You need to play a lot of different cards to like get it to work. Some more generic extra deck monsters in this sort of domain are the Nightmares. Nightmares are really cool. Nightmare Kerberos, Nightmare Phoenix, and I guess Nightmare Unicorn. They're all kind of just generic removal options that you can summon just by soaking up like 2 monsters on board. A very easy way to summon them is with Gofu, Black Queen Gofu the Winged Shadow.
Really, it's like the Nightmares standout generic removal because unlike many other forms of removal that one can play to help like keep control of the game, you don't have to draw them. You can just draw any combination of monsters that summon themselves in a way that you can link summon with them. And this is the power of extra deck removal in general. While like the Cyber Dragon packages are nice, and you have to play a couple extra deck monsters, but otherwise they don't really interfere with your game plan unless you were already going to go onto 3 summons every single turn repeatedly, because it like doesn't take your normal in a lot of cases and is only 2 summons, so you can still normal summon something alongside it. But like that demands that you draw the Cyber Dragon to actually get use out of it. And if you try and play more different copies of Cyber Dragons to get more use out of it, like if you're playing both Cyber Dragon and Toon Cyber Dragon, if you draw both together, then one of them doesn't have a Mega Fleet. So that's like a weakness where you have to consider the main deck cost investment compared to the Nightmares, which are only extra deck cost investment. And you can do things like run Gofu to instantly make a Nightmare with the co-link effect if you play Link Kuriboh, which is really powerful. But also just like sometimes having a monster stick to your board and then being able to normal summon something else and make a Nightmare to solve a problem. Like that sort of flexibility is basically mandatory in making sure that your deck has the capability of removing threats as they appear in a game. So they're like very much staple, and I would include them in every deck, even the ones which don't really use the extra deck, because if there is any card that you ever like somehow steal your opponent's stuff with Mind Control or Monster Reborn, a Nightmare is what you're going to make with it and have be useful in the vast majority of situations.
That's a perfect segue onto some other cards of our list here. Mind Control specifically, I quite like Brain Control in the side deck. It's got an errata, but I think if you side it in against decks that sort of normal summon a lot, or just use normal summon monsters, I think Brain Control can sort of live up to Mind Control. The plus of playing Mind Control is it really is just, it removes anything from the board. If you want to like punch in for damage, you can just do that. And you can also use a monster, as we've mentioned, for sort of link materials, exceed summons, whatever you like. Gradles kind of also fit into here. I'm not really sure if they count as removal. It's kind of more than that, because you're actually taking a monster forever. Gradles are really powerful.
Big note about Brain Control is that it doesn't have a restriction on attacking, which can be huge for a lot of decks.
And another side note about it is that it is monsters that can be normal summoned, but it doesn't have the requirement that they have to have been normal summoned. So a lot of decks like dragons that spam out like big main deck dudes that like generally are special summoned because like they're dragon rulers, or you used Red Eye's Spirit or something, or like Red Eye's Darkness Metal, but like they are still technically able to be normal summoned, which means they're still like a prime high damage target that you can just take to create a game swing. So that's another consideration when thinking about siding Brain Control.
Yeah, realistically, if you're playing Brain Control or Mind Control, if your opponent's deck doesn't go into the extra deck or doesn't use Nomi monsters, Brain Control is literally just a better Mind Control. And that's really saying something, where Mind Control is quite an absurd card. I mean, we saw Snatch Steal recently go from co-forbidden to semi-forbidden, because stealing a monster is so strong. Mind Control really isn't much of a step down from that, and Brain Control is kind of just a step up from Mind Control.
In certain situations, but yes.
Well, this is why I think you play it in the side deck, because you want to side it in only for the matchups that it's quite useful against.
It does cost 800 life points and targets only face-ups.
Yeah, Mind
is
Control
irrelevant.
is more useful versus like flip decks, because you can steal a monster and then flip it up and like get the full benefit if it has a flip effect for if you're in like a matchup versus flips. But it's like the power and flexibility of these sorts of generic removal options mean that they're like staples across the main and side for any type of deck, really.
I think something that everyone can really agree on is that things like Mind Control are kind of much better than the like classic removal that people used to play. So when Trinity was just new, people like didn't really know what removal was or what was good. I saw people play Smashing Ground and Fissure. You still see these in like side decks, but I'm not really convinced they're very good. Some other cards we've got on the list here are Soul Taker and Lightning Vortex. These cards have really been like on the edge. They're not quite good enough. Soul Taker makes something miss timing, but that's not really relevant today. Lightning Vortex, Trinity isn't really about making a massive board. Like, the chance that they have 3 monsters for you to go plus off of your Lightning Vortex, it's so situational. Like, even if you play this in the side deck, I don't know if it'll come out that often. How do you guys feel about these sort of, like, niche removal options?
I mean,
I think Lightning Vortex is one of those cards that you see, like you mentioned, see in a lot of side decks, but never actually see go in, because it doesn't actually get you closer to winning the game, which is what you need removal to be doing most of the time if it's going to be at a minus, which a lot of the time it's going to be at a minus, because if a deck somehow gets out 3 monsters that's like actually worth removing, some of them are bound to float. Like, it's not going to be a pure plus. So like maybe for deck discards you could go for that. Soul Taker, I just think it's dated and bad. You can just, especially now that Landfill Linkus is out, you can just use Mind Control.
I have something to throw in here. Soul Taker was actually useful in the TCG inside decks for a certain period of time years ago because of that missing timing thing. But it was specifically used in situations where you expected to play against Chaos Dragons and you needed to be able to remove the Light Pulsar without triggering its float effect because of the REDMD Light Pulsar loop. Or I brought in against Heroes because when your opponent made the Shining and then like if it floated into their single copy of Stratos again, that was like a lot of advantage accrued. And while these sorts of situations still exist in Trinity, the way cards have been printed going into the future with key things that you want to get rid of, like B.A. Dante and Beatrice, they don't miss timing anymore because that's just sort of a silly and confusing mechanic. And so this sort of moves into an upcoming card, which is Abyssal Judge or Abyssal Judicator. It's not like fully translated yet, but it functions similarly to Soul Taker. It's like you pay 1,000 life points and then make your opponent send a card.
It's you pay 1,500 life points, declare one type and attribute, make your opponent send one monster with the same type and attribute from the field to the graveyard, and if you do, your opponent cannot activate the effects of that monster, as well as activate effects of monsters with the same name for the rest of the turn. So basically you pay 1,500, declare a type and attribute, and they have to sack a monster of that type. It does send to the graveyard, and the opponent does it as a player action. So although like unkillable bosses aren't really legal in Trinity, you can use this to get rid of like an Apocryphal Towers or something similar. It gets around all forms of like protection.
Yeah. So I think that card can sort of lead to a resurgence of the ideology of Soul Taker, because it does what Soul Taker used to do, but responding to the power creep of the game, such that like you want to be able to 1-for-1 remove your opponent's important floating monsters while preventing the float effect, because I believe that the only reason someone would really want to 1-for-1 a monster like that, as opposed to just play their own game plan, is specifically with floodgate monsters. And this is something that you would also see in the TCG, such that when people would expect to play against like masked heroes with Darklaw and they needed the graveyard, they would play like single target removal at a certain density that they could always answer that Darklaw. And because in Trinity, like, we don't allow floodgate monsters that are like that impactful to exist, I believe that it's sort of like a relic of a TCG mindset to side something that's like comparatively ineffectual as single target removal that doesn't prevent a float. That sort of is, it only fits that like make sure you can make your plays through a negate niche or like a disruption niche.
Yeah, I think Lightning Vortex, Soul Taker is it's really good, but only when it's specifically good in order to target a certain thing. And like Trinity's so like diverse, you don't really get anything off of the missing the timing effect, and there's no specific monster that you have to out with spell-based removal. Building on that, I think trap-based removal is just better in general. Trinity's slow enough so decks really can play like a full set of 10 trap cards or whatever. And if you look at them, like, Torrential Tribute is absurd. Mirror Forces really are fine. Like, there's a lot of trap-based removal that's just better.
And also, like, the flexibility of trap-based removal all being, like, a higher spell speed than normal spell cards can mean that a lot of the problem monsters that you want to keep off the board and prevent your opponent from sticking, that, like, provide advantage, oftentimes comes with some sort of self-protection effect, otherwise it wouldn't be worth trying to spam. Specifically something like Omega, which in Dragon Rulers is like constant refueling of the graveyard with its return effect, but also difficult to out at spell speed 1 without using 2 cards because it has a quick effect to dodge. And traps sort of like help fill that niche by allowing you a diversity of removal that lets you deal with a variety of different resilient threats, which is like really why you play removal in general, specifically in Trinity, because of the speed of the format, is you need to be able to answer all of the different threats that you may face, and traps are just like similar to but better than playing something like Soul Taker would be.
Yeah, I think that wraps it up on mediocre removal spells that people put in their side decks but never side in.
Punk brought up an interesting one just as we're building this list. Instant Fusion into like one of my favorite cards. Do you want to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, Thousand Eyes Restrict, famous from GOAT formats.
Oh yeah.
It's rather notable because it's non-destruction, of course, and you have the flexibility of going into Norden, which is unlimited here. And also invoke it Raijin, either if you're a flip deck and want it for your sub-terror effects, or if you just want it for a guy that can start Book of Mooning them the next turn. But going into Thousand Eyes lets you get instant removal, and then you can link it away into Link Rebo if you want to attack the turn. It is, however, notable that you don't prevent floating altogether. It's because a lot of cards have if they're sent from the field to the graveyard, and they're still on the field when they're equipped to Thousand Eyes, so that's something to look out for. But overall, I think it's a really solid, like, high utility option to put into your extra if you have the space.
Some other things there is if you play any recursion like Premature Burial, Instant Fusion does actually fusion summon the monster, so you can prem back your like Thousand Eyes, which is pretty neat. Also going into Nodin, Nodin can make a rank 4. Some of the monster removal we haven't really mentioned is like 101 Castel. Just the rank 4 toolbox is monster removal. I don't think any synchros are relevant enough to like discuss, but 101 is definitely very good here. It's similar to Mega Fleet in the sense where not only are you removing a monster with 101, you're also creating like a threat of your own. In this case, a 2100 monster that can't be destroyed once, which is pretty cool. I think that wraps it up for monster removal, unless anyone wants to talk about something else.
Well, I had a small point to add, like, continuing to that. the sort of like rank 4 toolbox of monster removal, while it's like definitely a trade-off from sort of playing the generic Link toolbox of monster removal, because Link monsters require it's like just different names, can be any levels. The different names is basically a non-concern in a singleton format, and there are always workarounds with token generators. And so like the trade-off between focusing on like Links as your extra deck based removal that you don't have to rely on drawing and rank 4s is that the rank 4s are more specific but also have more powerful options. Like even just directly comparing Nightmare Cerberus to like Castellar 101, both require 2 monsters, but the Nightmare requires you to pitch a card, it destroys, it only hits it like doesn't hit all of your opponent's monster zones, and it's 1600, so like the threat that it leaves on board is just very wimpy compared to the 2000 plus rank 4 options that don't destroy. And so like I appreciate these differences because they allow avenues for decks to be built along different lines with like meaningful distinctions and trade-offs in what they're capable of doing. And another thing that this sort of like goes into, but also can go into our next topic well, is Evil Swarm Exciton Knight is unlimited in Trinity right now, and that's like the big papa of rank 4 based removal, because it's like mass removal, and it hits spells and traps too, and that's like the big payoff of playing rank 4 options in general, really, compared to playing a synchro based deck or another extra deck based thing, because having monster removal is good, but there are some decks that just play like a handful of monsters, so instead you need spell and trap removal.
Yeah, this brings us on to the next topic, which is just like, do you want to talk about generic removal or sort of like Exciton-based removal?
I was trying to lead that into spell and trap removal, because
we can go into spell and trap removal. I think Exciton is it'll keep people hooked.
Yeah.
Going into spell and trap removal, the thing about Trinity that I always say, when people first look into a Highlander format, your first thoughts are generally about inconsistencies, because you don't realize that there are lots of very similar cards that do very similar things. And one of the things I always said to people was, yeah, in Trinity you can only play one Mystical Space Typhoon, but that doesn't mean that spell and trap removal is inconsistent, because there are so many cards that do really similar things. We've got a whole list of them here. MST's the base one that Punk Rock Lee absolutely hates, because Cosmic Cyclone is supposedly better. Do you want to talk about that quickly?
Well, yeah, you can play MST if you're a sucker, but really paying those 1,000 life points to get the Banishing spell trap is going to matter some games. I mean, sure, those 1,000 life points are also going to matter some games, but I really, really think you're winning more games versus decks like True Draco or Pendulum, or even just decks that can recycle their spells. It's really, really valuable to banish the spells that are valuable to banish. Whereas, just like, if MST instead said gain 1,000, I think people would be way, way less scared. Of course, it's not exactly the same, because you can't pay for life points you don't have, but I really do think that Cosmic is the superior choice to MST, but some decks can play both. Pendulums, I mentioned. I usually choose to play MST in that deck, because you can afford the minus of cards like Twin Twister.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful segue here. Twin Twister is a card I think is actually too powerful, but that's for a different discussion. Discard a card, pop 2. Is it double MST? Who knows? The problem, the thing that makes Twin Twisters so good is firstly against Pendulum decks or heavy back row decks. So if you set 2 Pendulum Scales, Twin Twisters, boom, gone. Get out of there. You can just blow up both scales, which can really push a Pendulum matchup in your favour. Secondly, Twin Twisters and also heavy Storm Duster, which is quite similar. It's just a trap version that doesn't need the discard. Both of these force your opponent to think about how much back row they should set. Because if you set just one back row, you might get popped to like some of the other cards we're going to mention here, an MST, Cosmic Cyclone. if you set exactly 2, you're going to get blown out by Twin Twisters or Heavy Stormduster. You're making that risk. So it kind of puts your back row decks into a niche where you're considering how much back row to set, and maybe even if you want to bluff back row at first. Like, I really don't want this card to get blown up by Twin Twisters, so I'll sort of set 2 other cards, wait a turn, see if he's going to blow them up. What do you guys think about these mind games? What do you guys think about the fact that some of the spell-based removal here is destroys more than one card?
I mean, I think that sort of interaction is very important in being a skill check and helping make for, like, the better player to win more often. And I think that also from a deck building perspective, even though, like, on the surface, hand traps don't function as well as traps, while in the TCG it's like all a crap fest because games are 1 and 2 turns. So, like, you have to play hand traps because going first is, like, going second, you need a way to interact on your opponent's first turn. Trinity games take long enough that that's not the main concern here. And I think that the reason why hand traps are still very valuable and need main and side deck space is because they are disruption that you can rely on even if your opponent has spell and trap hate. And that's sort of the thing about spell and trap hate is, like, I definitely agree that Cosmic Cyclone's better than MST and that, like, Twin Twisters, Cosmic Cyclone, and Heavy Stormduster are powerful enough and, like, basically main deck worthy in almost every deck. Also, if you go down the line, though, there are MST clones which are, like, alright, but, like, definitely worth siding if you're playing against someone who's playing a control deck heavy enough that they will, like, set 4+ and be like, even if you have Heavy Stormduster, you won't clear the way. But stuff like MST,
I think Galaxy Cyclone,
yes,
and Paleozoic are quite worth talking
there's
about.
There's a Paleo Trap, and there's Galaxy Cyclone, and there's, like, Night Beam if you're really getting down there, and also another big one for its flexibility, Archfiend Eccentric, which is like an MST in the pendulum scale, but also if you're not playing against a super back row heavy deck, or if you, like, need a level 3 Fiend if you're playing a tour guide engine, you can normal summon it to be an exiled force against a monster. So there's just, like, a lot of options which would never get played in the TCG because you just, like, throw in 3 Twin Twisters and 3 Cosmics and that's enough. But, like, they exist, and also they help because they allow you to sort of, like, force through your plays in a way that you really need. And I always appreciate that sort of, like, mind game of playing a certain amount of back rows, playing, like, no back row when your opponent's trying to play spell and trap removal to force their plays through, the position of hand traps when, like, if your opponent has an MST and you have one piece of disruption and it's like a torrential, then you're going to get blown out. But if it's like a ghost ogre, then, like, they're the ones who are sitting on a dead MST. So it's just, like, really interesting and skillful.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point about you only the like deck building choice here. So I mean, in the TCG, one of these is always just going to be the best. You just play 3 of it. But in Trinity, like, maybe Twin Twisters is the best for this format because, like, I don't know, discarding is really good. You can still only play 1 Twin Twisters unless you're, like, really dedicated. So, like, then you have to start thinking about sort of the next level of spell and trap removal. And maybe your deck's really weak against back row. Like, you have to start thinking of all these niche options. And it's important to sort of have a mental list of all the different spell and trap removal that's kind of very similar but slightly different and maybe better in a different deck. Like, Eccentric in a tour guide deck is you wouldn't play Eccentric if you're not playing tour guide, I think. And it's this interesting deck building conundrum that the Highlander nature brings to the format.
Yeah,
that's one thing I think is quite overlooked about Eccentric that you both mentioned a lot, that it's not always the next best option. Well, it's not a quick spell.
They can target it.
And they can destroy it after you target one of their spell traps, and then you have no idea what's under that spell trap they protected. If they have, like, a free pop under their side of the board, they just have, like, one of the rare Dryden clones of the format, or they just have their own MST, and then you have a back row you have to be scared of, guaranteed.
The best mind game I saw, I think I was playing against Meep, I'm not sure. I had Eccentric in the Pendulum Zone, and he had 2 back rows set. and I used Eccentric just to target like a random one of his back row. He chains the other one, and I can't remember if it's Cosmic or MST, but he gets rid of my Eccentric. So now I'm really worried about what his other back row is, because like he used one of his cards to negate my Eccentric, like what's it going to be? Is it like a Mirror Force? And it turns out that his other card was just like another MST or something. It was like, the first one was a Cosmic and his other back row was an MST. And it's this like horrible mind game of like, he's destroyed my Eccentric Archfiend. What is he trying to protect?
That actually reminds me of probably my favorite mind game I've ever done with spell and trap removal. I was playing versus Guilty in the tournament, and he opens up turn 1 in his Isoul deck. He opens up with Aqua Dolphin, like this is the TCG or something. He manages to hit my Rapier, but he also gets to look at my hand, which includes a Chaos Trap Hole. He does his Isoul stuff, searches BLS, and on my turn, I set 3 cards and put up some defensive play. I can't remember what it was. The thing to note is those 3 cards did not include the Chaos Trap Hole, which I needed to live. But he knows that I needed to live, so he will, and he knows he's got time, so he doesn't have to like play his BLS into the Chaos Trap Hole. He can just remove it with his other cards, and so he does, including removing the last one with the Nightmare Unicorn. Meaning he doesn't even get to see the fact that he hasn't actually removed the Chaos Trap Hole. So he just summoned it straight into the Chaos Trap Hole. That's
like next level Jedi mind tricks.
Yeah.
Although that one, I was only like confident enough to do that one because I respect Guilty Gear's skill as a player, and he would like actually remember I had it and play around it.
If you really wanted to get rid of a lot of back row, though, you should play the next card on this list, which is Zaphion the Time Lord. Oh my god, Zaphion is so good.
Although he's not actually great at getting rid of like actual back row.
Yeah.
He's better at getting rid of spells and traps that happen to occupy the spell and trap zones, like pendulums.
Yeah.
I think looking at this card on the surface, you equate it to like Harpy's Feather Duster or something. But then you realise that like it's the most fair Harpy's Feather Duster you've ever seen. Like, they can chain pretty much anything to it just to stop it. And then it shuffles on your turn. How, like, splashable do you think it is?
It definitely depends on what you're expecting to play against. I think, like, almost any deck could play it. Most decks would not choose to play it unless they are, like, explicitly expecting to play against, like, pacifist control and need to be able to, like, grind through back row like that. But it's like definitely good, but because it almost certainly takes your whole turn, because you can't, like, it has to have a clear field to be normal summoned. It takes your normal summon, so you have to have like another play from hand that requires special summoning after you summon it. So it's definitely like, it fills a certain niche that isn't the most productive, because playing a slow card against a deck that wants to play slow, the sort that you would set for back row in and would want to bring in Zaphion against. So it's like not as great as it could be, but that's sort of like a balancing act, because actual just Heavy Storm is obviously like incredibly powerful and broken in a way. And this is like very much just a fair but thus weak Heavy Storm. Or Harpy's Feather Duster, I guess. Technically even better, because it shuffles instead of like destroys, just in case someone's playing Artifacts or Silver Sentinel.
I think I really like the mind games that Heavy Storm, the actual card, brings into older formats. Like in Goat Control, like setting your Heavy Storm and stuff, it's really fun. But I think Heavy Storm inherently is just a very unfun card, especially for people who aren't used to playing against it. I really like that there are like more ways to deal with Heavy Storm, because realistically, like, I love playing with the card in some formats. I don't think it's right for Trinity, though. Like, there's really no way to counteract it other than, like, crazy mind games. And even then, when you're trying to promote 60-card decks, your Heavy Storm is just really sacky. Zaphion the Time Lord, I think, it's more of like a fair version because it's a monster.
Well, I mean, that's sort of what it comes down to, is the only back row that's worth protecting is the same back row that could stop a Zaphion from resolving in the vast majority of cases, just because effect negation is like primo back row, because it can both be, it's like the disruption of effect negation is like really powerful, because otherwise you're just going to get it wiped by a Zaphion instead of being able to actually remove your, like, use your strong removal back row, like a Mirror Force or something. That's sort of like the eternal struggle of Mirror Force, is like, it's obviously incredibly powerful and it can be like a +4 at best, but if you let your opponent summon 5 monsters to the board, chances are that they're going to have, like, one of those monsters is going to have a way to remove the Mirror Force, like if they summon a Nightmare Phoenix along the way, or a Tornado Dragon or something. So it's just like an interesting balance. I sort of wanted to go back to like talking about deck building just a little bit, because there was something that I wanted to say there. I believe that the game, like, despite being completely singleton, it is still always about balance, because you can play certain cards that fill the same niche. Like, we were talking about spell trap removal having, like, Cosmic Cyclone, which is, like, slightly better than, but effectively equivalent to MST in the role that they play. And so understanding that you should play, like, maybe 6 to 8 pieces of spell trap removal across your main and side deck to ensure that you have them when you need them. Like, making those decisions based on, like, the deck composition of your deck and, like, how much of each certain thing that it needs is very important and very skillful and very enjoyable. And understanding, like, when you're playing removal, that you need some things that are, like, hard removal, like a mind control for if your opponent goes first and summons a big-ass dude. But other times you need something like a breakthrough skill, because maybe you're the one who goes first and then your opponent's going to go plus a bajillion unless you negate this effect, and the mind control would be sitting in your hand dead at that point. So understanding the, like, ratios and what your deck needs and how each card fills a certain role is just very satisfying, interesting, and fun to me.
But yeah, let's move on to some more flexible pieces of removal.
I keep on saying these big long things and then it goes all quiet. Ooh.
I'm just so astounded by your, like, Mandela-style speeches. I'm just awesome. You know?
Well, thank you.
Punk is right, though. We should move on to the last topic. We couldn't really, like, fit these into anything else, so we put, like, is either both spell and trap and monster removal, or is just, like, generic removal in general, if that makes sense. The first on the list is something we alluded to earlier. Evil Swarm Exciton Knight. I don't actually know if it's Exciton or Exciton. Can someone clarify if they know?
I always said Exciton, but I have no clue either, so...
I just say it like that because it's more Exciton.
I guess it's like an exit to, like, whatever's on the board. Regardless, this is very similar to Zaphion the Time Lord, in the sense that it's, like, mass removal, but it's a monster effect, so it's actually kind of easy to out. Especially here, where not only can you breakthrough skill the Exciton or whatever, you can also stop them just from making a rank 4, which kind of puts another twist on it. If you know they're playing a rank 4 deck, or if they have 2 level 4 monsters on the field, you can sort of, like, guess they're playing Exciton. You can also play around it by playing less, like, trying to reduce your card advantage just so they can't actually Exciton Knight you. How do you guys feel about it? Do you think it's, like, too strong? I definitely think it's a staple in most decks that can make a rank 4.
I mean, it's really strong, but I think one of the things that stands out about it in a good way is the fact that at unlimited as it is right now, every deck that could make it will play it. And that sort of helps, because that means if you see that your opponent is running 2 level 4 monsters, like, a good player will already have Exciton Knight in mind as something that they need to play around and have an answer for. And, like, for example, if we were like, Exciton Knight's too strong, let's semi it, all of a sudden it becomes a crapshoot, because you don't know if your opponent is playing the, like, 5 extra cards to include Exciton. And seeing those level 4 monsters is just like, well, they might have it, I guess, because all of a sudden it's a trade-off instead of an auto-include. And this is sort of why, like, I think having a certain level of powerful staples is like beneficial for the game because it helps like encourage these sorts of thoughtful interactions.
I think Exciter Knight's one of those cards where if you didn't see it coming, you probably did something wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's also pretty interesting. Also, another nuance to its effect is that it's a quick effect. It can not only be used during your main phase, also during your opponent's battle phase, and it also comes in, like, for example, if someone tries to trap hole you or use a quick pop effect on you, they can't really do it, just like as you summon it, because then you're just gonna chain it. Yeah. But what I wanted to get to with it was that people say like format warping as a really bad thing about some cards, but I think that Exton is format warping in a positive way, in that it makes you think about what you put onto the board, if you need this on the board, if it can stay in your hand, if maybe not.
It's really meant to kind of just stop overextending, which is not really something that happens too often with the summon limit. But like, if you dedicate everything to the board and you know your opponent's playing rank 4s, like, you kind of just made a mistake there. You've got to like hold back, you've got to know when they're going to play the Exciton, if they're going to play it, like how to play around it. Try not to set too much back row unless you do actually have an out to it.
As a Pendulum player, I can definitely say it's possible to overextend in Trinity.
Yeah, I really appreciate this sort of like idea that it's format warping in a not necessarily bad way, because I believe the existence of cards like Exciton Knight and also Omega and other things, it's like they shape the deck building decisions that you have to make sure that you're ready for. Like we were sort of talking about how every piece of back row worth protecting needs to be like something of the sort that can answer a Zaphion to help prevent blowouts. But that's sort of also true with Exciton in a way, where like I have a pet theory that the popularity of cards like Bottomless Trap Hole are heavily reduced because if your opponent summons an Exciton into your Bottomless Trap Hole, they still nuke the board because it's a quick effect. And so like understanding the role that each card in your deck plays and what it can beat and what it can't, and understanding how people like what other people are going to play and the capabilities of their deck. I think that's a very important skill in Yu-Gi-Oh! In general. Like, knowing what your opponent could possibly do and how you need to prepare for that is, like, next level thinking in a way that makes the game more interesting.
Yeah, again, I really like these kind of, like, monster effects that is format warping, but there are ways to get around it, there are ways to play around it, there's something to expect in the game, which I think games which get extremely diverse have this issue of you don't know what to prepare for. Mm-hmm. And I think having like solid staples which really are actually fair if you know how to like fight them, I think it's really good to have in the game.
Yeah.
It's also kind of a pseudo buff to like odd rogue decks, because if you're preparing for these staple or meta strategies, you're generally like reducing the general strength of your deck, unless you just incidentally happen to put in hate versus them, in which case, whoops.
Yeah, there's actually, we're going to have to do a different podcast about this topic, but I believe that there's something to be said about the distinction between trying to make a format in a way that encourages more interesting individual games versus that encourages more interesting deck building decisions. Because I believe that, like, ideally, both of these things can be very highly valued, but in a lot of ways, the practical, like, what happens in reality is that if you're playing a format where there's, like, 3 decks, people will be more frustrated on a game-to-game level because there's less diversity, and they, like, play against the same thing over and over again, and that can be boring and frustrating. But also, like, having a defined meta helps create an opening for...
Talking about, like, game design literally makes me just want to talk for hours, but we've got to stay on topic here. Sorry, dude.
Wait, you're just going to cut me off? That's so sad.
Save it for the next podcast.
Okay. You hear that, listeners? Listen to the next one, and we'll talk your ear off. Just like this
Stay
one.
tuned.
But even more.
Next up on the list, we have Yuki Usagi. No one's called it that for a very long time, unless you're Asian. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. Hand traps really aren't, like, that relevant in Trinity when compared to the TCG. So, if you look at the TCG, your deck's sort of like, you go off turn 1, and that doesn't really happen in Trinity. So there's no need to, have the hand trap as a result of the game being fast. Instead, hand traps are very useful, as we sort of alluded to earlier, in the sense where you can't destroy them by spell and trap removal. Confiscation's banned now, and it wasn't played anyway. There's really no way to, get around a Ghost Ogre. And that kind of makes it much more, interesting as a card. On top of the fact that it's also a tuner, you do see it being used for synchros a lot. And the fact that it's just a strong effect in general, when a card is activated, just pop it. It's probably a better version of Bad Aim. What do you guys think about Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit?
I mean, I think it's great. I was sort of talking a little bit about hand traps, in general earlier, because, I believe it's almost at the point where it's, main deck staple, but I definitely believe it's side deck staple. Because when you've started siding and you know whether you won or lost the first game, you can, if you lost, you can choose whether or not to go first, and if you choose to go second, you can switch a trap for a hand trap that's very similar, like Bad Aim for Ghost Ogre, and ensure that you have one more live card going first, which can be what makes the difference. But also the idea that as an individual card, having Ghost Ogre exist means that it's an avenue to play around heavy spell and trap hate. And even control decks that set a bajillion sometimes need to also play hand traps, because otherwise they might get blown out by an Exciton Knight. And if they do, they need some sort of defense. Or if your opponent is siding trap stun, it just it helps add to the counterplay possible when deck building. And so, I mean, I'm a big fan.
Yeah, I think Ghost Ogre is pretty underrated as well, especially putting it into main decks. You see it in most sides, but I mean, it's incredibly flexible since it can kill both monsters and spells, and it can help ease the pressure of the one you need the most. If you need more help, again, disrupting monsters, you can use it for that. But if you're versus something like, say, Pacifist, which plays a ton of traps, you can ease the pressure of your spell trap removal to be able to kill more back row without needing it to kill Pacifist.
The amount of times I've used Ghost Ogre not as a hand trap is also, probably higher than it should be. In Dragon Rulers, I've used Ghost Ogre a lot to make Leo Keeper of the Sacred Tree, the, Synchro.
Yeah.
Also, it sounds a bit weird, you'll probably laugh at me for saying this. 1800 defense is quite a bit. A lot of the time I've, top-decked a Ghost Ogre and, saved myself for 2 or 3 turns because they just couldn't attack over it.
A Trickstar player in Advanced just said amen.
Yes. 1800, too thick.
Being a tuner, I don't know, I've played this in rank 4 and made sort of Black Rose before. I'm sure you're not meant to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense.
Why not? Premature, you've used your Ghost Ogre earlier, you premature burial back something, you've already got a level 4 on board. Boom. Black Rose nuke the field. But Black Rose could probably be in, this section in general. You can't make it that easily. Probably just Destrudo is the main one. But, nuking the board is really not anything to scoff at.
That's, a great point to hit on. So I'm happy you brought it up. Because it's, the flexibility of hand traps when you don't need that disruption. It's, a trap is a trap, such that if you have Torrential and you already have, board control and are pushing for game, it's basically a useless card. And it's nice because, if your opponent makes a comeback, then maybe it's useful again, but it doesn't actually accelerate your chances of winning the game at all. Whereas if you are in a certain situation, hand traps have that sort of flexibility. Even just on the most basic level, the fact that all of them are well, not all of them, I guess, poor Gores. They can be normal summoned and made into a nightmare or something just to put more damage on board or to clear the way for another play. Or the Ghost Girl hand traps and also Effect Veiler specifically, they're tuners and can be used for flexible plays because a lot of rank 4 decks function based on having a way to special a level 4 and then normal a level 4 and then make their rank 4 and that's the turn. But you can also combine any of your special level 4s with a normal summon Ghost Ogre and do something like make Michael or Moonlit Rose or Black Rose, like you were saying. And that's like very low commitment in the extra deck because it's like 1 to 3 options without actually changing your main deck, but it makes your deck a lot more flexible, which can really help in slower matchups where you're like, dang, my Exciton was negated and now I have no way through this 5 back row. But eventually, if your opponent doesn't kill you beforehand, which they probably won't because they're playing 5 back row instead of like big dragons or something, you can get to a Ghost Ogre and try and force through a Black Rose and like still have an avenue to win in that game. So like, they're just really great from like a flexibility standpoint, being able to destroy multiple things in the case of Ghost Ogre, and from like the standpoint of being both disruption as a hand trap, but also like a body for when you need to make a play. Well, I think that it's mostly my fault that we went a little long on this one, but I guess that we should wrap it up then. So
we can cover like the rest of them, just like Shotfire. We have Sky Striker removal, Afterburners, and whatever the other one's called. Are these played?
Yeah, you have to build around these, but they're very good when you get the second effect. Just any +1 of removal is really good. The second one is non-targeting. You can get them back. You can search them.
High restrictions, high power.
They're good.
There's a combo you can do, which I'll say very quickly, so unless you're watching this, you probably won't get it. You go Hornet Drones, summon the Wind one, attack directly, you mill one of the removal spells, then you make Kagari add back your removal spell, play the removal spell, pop that thing, then you make Shizuka in the end phase to search your other removal spell. So you can turn Hornet Drones into like a +4, I think. But yeah,
plus 1500 damage.
It doesn't really happen often, but like there are 3 Sky Striker links, so you can do it in Trinity. I just thought that was cool. Moving on the list, Gofu, we've already covered this. This is a 1-card nightmare. Not only that, you also get your like co-linked thing because you can make Link Karibo and then make your nightmare, which is pretty neat. Dark Hole, we're getting into like co-forbidden and semi-forbidden cards here. Do you think Dark Hole's worth playing? I've played it in a few decks before at co-forbidden. Just in general, do you guys think like Dark Hole's a fine co-card?
Yeah, it's one of the better ones.
I think it's worse than either Millions, which is another very, very good removal options in a lot of decks, but decks that almost every turn use up the entire summon limit and don't really need stuff to survive from the last turn.
The gold standard for co-forbidden cards for me is Solemn Strike now. I think that's kind of like, you have to gauge your card, is this better or worse than a Solemn Strike? And I think Dark Hole really could be up there. Eater of Millions, definitely. We've already discussed, Time Lords, Zathion. A lot of the other ones are good. Time Maiden's co-forbidden, so if you want to like splash that in, that's also fine. Camion is one of the really good ones that spins anything and they can't respond. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and it doesn't target.
Does it not target?
Yeah,
that's pretty good.
Wild.
Metion,
really
I don't think it's too great, but it's alright.
I thought it did target, but I mean, you can't respond, so it doesn't really matter that it targets.
But that does bring us up to the end of the list. Does anyone else want to talk just in general about removal?
I've talked too much. Take it away.
Punk, anything to say?
Yeah, I think we just have to escape.
Yeah, well, I think that kind of just covers everything. There are certainly a lot of pieces of removal. I think there are just a lot of cards that are viable in Trinity in general. In the next podcast, we're talking kind of on a similar topic. I think we'll cover consistency cards in general. Hopefully it won't be as long as this one. But until then, stay groovy!
Aw, yes.